Thank you, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Green. It's good to see you at the committee, and really appreciate your leadership at USAID. I wanted to ask you about a couple of countries in Africa. Sudan, 30 years after taking power in a coup, President Bashir now faces an unprecedented challenge to his regime as protesters continue a peaceful resistance movement now almost 4 months old. In response, the government has arrested several thousand people and further restricted political space. While U.S. assistance in Sudan is restricted, Congress has long supported USAID's effort to mitigate conflict and promote more inclusive and participatory governance. The administration's fiscal year 2020 request proposes a major cut to such programs, eliminating conflict mitigation and stabilization funding and cutting democracy and governance by 30%. What impact would these proposed cuts have on the ability of the U.S. to support Sudan's opposition and civil society in their effort to encourage political reforms?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As always, it is great to engage with you on Africa. I'm well aware of the love you have for the continent. What's going on in Sudan is heartbreaking. It just is deeply heartbreaking. As you know, USAID's piece of the 5-track approach is humanitarian access for refugees and IDPs, as well as some aspects of human rights protection. And what has happened is obviously a setback in so many ways. And as I said, it's deeply disturbing. There are things that Sudan needs to do, just straight up, that the government must take on. And I think it's fair to say that we have constantly impressed upon them the need for creating constructive engagement as opposed to what they're doing with transparency, because if they don't address that, it's very difficult to foresee a better relationship and a brighter path for the country.
Well, and let me just ask, because the funding cuts, as I understand them, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, impact our support to Sudan's opposition and civil society. So I know, if we're going to go in a direction to enter into phase 2, I wasn't even referring to that. I was really referring to our support for democratic reforms and cutting those resources.
Well, as a general matter across the continent, very obviously tough choices are being made. We will do everything we can to make those dollars go as far as we can, effectively and efficiently. As to the particular implications for Sudan, quite frankly, I'll have to get back to you and make sure that we brief your staff. I'm just not familiar enough with the details.
Okay, and the next was about Power Africa. Power Africa 2.0, which launched last year, is an updated strategy to improve energy access in Africa. And I wanted to know how this version differs from the administration's work in the past.
Power Africa 2.0, I think, is applying the lessons that we've learned in terms of the need for a better enabling environment. So the greatest thing about Power Africa has been how opportunistic it is in the sense of identifying and closing deals rapidly. In 2.0, as much as anything, we're working more broadly to provide or to push for the kinds of reforms to the enabling environment that open the door for more investment, which will allow us to have a greater impact across the continent. So it's taking the opportunism that we've seen and applying it more broadly by applying the lessons that we've learned as to what a country needs to have available if American private investment is going to be able to take advantage of the opportunity.
And then maybe in the last few seconds, I know you were addressing the Ebola crisis that's happening in the DRC, and perhaps you can expand on that. What are we doing to get resources there?
In terms of what we're trying to do, again, working closely with CDC and trying to reinforce the Ministry of Health. I've been in constant contact with Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization, urging a more aggressive vaccination approach, which I think is called for. In terms of the financial resources, it actually isn't a fiscal issue. There's sufficient money for fighting Ebola in DRC. However, with the vaccines that we have available, to produce more takes 8 to 10 months. And so we're urging a more aggressive approach, not only in potentially geographic vaccination, but also rebuilding supplies. We have plenty of supplies currently available, but with this new flare-up that we've seen, we think more aggressive vaccination is called for, and therefore that we need to see more advanced purchases to rebuild those supplies.